Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Lee Taylor, and on behalf of our co-conveners, the Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities, and Mental Health America of Kentucky, I just want to welcome you this morning to our 10th anniversary System of Care Academy. Our theme this year is celebrating our system of care, past, present, and future. I have two quick slides to share with you before we move into the presentation. Our session today is in Zoom webinar. That means that all attendees are muted and your videos are off. We are recording the session and we will have it available soon. If you watch the System of Care Academy website later today or the first of next week, we will start posting links from our previous sessions. Please use the Q&A box for any questions for our presenter. And then our chat box if you have any questions for the host or any tech issues, those types of things. We do plan to have time at the end of the session for questions and answers. An American Sign Language interpreter will be on screen with us throughout the session, and we are using auto captions. If you do not see the captions at the bottom, click on your CC button at the bottom of your screen, and that should turn them on for you. I'm going to pin our interpreter really quick. I didn't realize I didn't have her pinned. Okay. For continuing education and certificates of attendance, you must be in the content portion of the webinar for at least 90% of the session to be eligible for a certificate. This is a mandate by the boards. You are not required to sign in via chat. Zoom captured your sign-in when you entered your email address to enter. That email address is the unique identifier to track your attendance throughout the academy. So you must use the same email address to register for each session and for entering each session. Within 2 weeks, attendees who are present for at least 90% of the session will receive an email with a session evaluation link. When you complete that evaluation, the very next screen will take you to your certificate. From that page, you can either save or print your certificate. We do not mail those or email those. You'll have access to that website where you can return at any time to access certificates from 2019 through this year. So I recommend bookmarking that link. And now I would like to welcome today's presenter. Our session is building capacity to improve prevention and response to human trafficking in Kentucky communities. And it is an honor to have Melissa Castellanos with us today. Marissa is a graduate from the University of Kentucky, and she has been, for over 16 years, been doing extensive work around human trafficking. She is the founder and director of the Coterie and a director of grants at Love 146. And she is a member of so many groups, both federally and in the state, as far as human trafficking, several work groups, committees, and councils. And we're proud to have her in Kentucky as a part of this Kentucky statewide human trafficking task force. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Marissa and not take up any more of her time. Welcome, Marissa.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you all so much for having me, for being here today to learn more about human trafficking in Kentucky and what we can all do in our work every day to make a difference and build capacity. So this morning, what we're going to focus on is recommendations from the 2024 Kentucky Statewide Human Trafficking Data Report. This report was very recently published in February of this year. It's been in the works for more than 2 years, and you today are the first folks in the whole state to hear a fairly comprehensive presentation of what we found in this report and what it means, and to hear in depth the recommendations that are being made in this report. So thank you very much for being here. I welcome any questions from you as we go through the presentation. If you will just make sure and put those in the question box. And if it's something that would be best to be answered right away, I think the conveners will, ask it at that time. Otherwise, I will try to save some time at the end for questions. So please ask them. I meant to do this before I started the presentation part, but let me just put into the chat the link to the online report so that you all can access it in case you haven't seen it yet and you want to look at it a little bit while we're talking this morning. I just want to make sure that you're able to do that. So let me just, give me one second. Um, Let me just type that in the chat really fast. If you go to, sorry, let me just, I think I'll have to put it in the chat a little bit later. Sorry, because I already set up my screen. So my apologies for that. And I will make sure and put the link to the report in the chat at the end. So please make sure and hold on for that. So our objectives for today's presentation are to increase our knowledge of recent data on human trafficking in Kentucky, to learn about recommendations made in the report to improve capacity in prevention, identification, and response to trafficking in Kentucky, and to talk about some specific actions that we can take to support local anti-trafficking efforts here. I thought it would be helpful. We have a really big group today, and I would imagine we have a variety of backgrounds and experiences related to human trafficking. And so just to have sort of a baseline as we get started, I want to make sure that we provide just a foundation about what I mean when I'm talking about human trafficking. So what is it that this report is even talking about? So we have a really strong federal definition of trafficking, which identifies that a severe form of trafficking in persons can include either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And it's a crime that involves exploiting a person for their labor services or for commercial sexual activities. And commercial sexual activities are defined as any sexual act that's exchanged for something that has a commercial value. And that exchange could be money, or it could be other things of value, like a place to stay, basic food items, and other basic needs that someone has. It could even involve exchanging drugs for the sexual acts, right? But when it's sex trafficking, the idea, or when it's sex trafficking involving commercial sex, the idea is that there's this element of control that's being used against the victim, force or fraud or coercion, that's compelling them to engage in that activity. Or, according to federal law and Kentucky state law, anyone under the age of 18 who's involved in commercial sexual activities is automatically considered a victim of sex trafficking because they cannot consent to engage in those commercial sexual activities because of their age. Labor trafficking also involves that element of force, fraud, or coercion. But in labor trafficking, it's required along the spectrum of age. So even with minors, you have to show that there was some sort of control, compelling the individual into exploitative labor or services. And our federal and state laws also break down these definitions of force, fraud, and coercion. So for anything to potentially be labor or sex trafficking, with the exception of sex trafficking of minors, we have to know that at least one type of control, the force, the fraud, or the coercion was present. And oftentimes there's multiple types of control, right, used in this sort of interpersonal violence. Just to give you a sense of really how trafficking can present in so many ways to us. You know, it sounds so simple to say there's sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking, but the National Human Trafficking Hotline analyzed just thousands and thousands of calls that they've received over the past 2 decades. And based on those calls and all of their data analysis, they identified 25 primary types of human trafficking in their typology report. And you can access that typology report yourself online if you go to the citation that's on your screen at polarisproject.org. But these typologies in the report, each type has unique strategies for recruiting and controlling victims and concealing the crime. And so they all have a unique business model, different profiles for who the traffickers and victims are, and different control mechanisms that they utilize. And to give you a sense of what those look like, you can see them on your screen now. I'm not going to go through all of them. Many of them are self-explanatory, but I do find it helpful. And for me, it was really eye-opening to learn that of the 25 typologies of trafficking, 19 are clearly in the space of labor trafficking, and about 6 include sex trafficking, and some have really an overlap where there's oftentimes both sex and labor trafficking. So I just want to give you a sense for what we mean when we say human trafficking, that it does involve sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and that there are these different typologies. So it can present in our communities in a variety of ways. So with that, I want to jump more specifically into the content of the statewide data report. So as I mentioned, this data report is intended to be, a comprehensive look at data specific to human trafficking in our state. The Kentucky statewide Human Trafficking Task Force has been supporting anti-trafficking efforts in Kentucky since its founding of the task force in 2013. And over these years, tremendous work has been done to increase identification of human trafficking in Kentucky communities through training and awareness efforts, supporting survivors through the provision of specialized services, holding traffickers accountable through investigations and prosecutions, preventing trafficking through education, outreach, and awareness efforts, and to create systemic change through policy advocacy. So this statewide data report is meant to be a comprehensive report, as comprehensive as it can be, of existing and accessible multidisciplinary data that will be helpful in evaluating anti-trafficking efforts and promoting evidence-based best practices. So in this report, several recommendations are made within the context of the many years of anti-trafficking work that's been done in Kentucky and elsewhere. And implementing these recommendations will really take multidisciplinary collaboration across government, civil society, and the private sector as Kentucky continues to expand and improve anti-trafficking efforts to make Kentucky safer for all of us. And so that really includes all of you today, right? It is going to be a multi-sector effort to continue to move forward in our anti-trafficking efforts. So I want to make sure before we jump into the data itself that I let you know that this statewide data report was co-authored by myself and Dr. Glenn Harden. Dr. Harden is the chair of the Data and Research Working Group of the Kentucky Statewide Human Trafficking Task Force. So the entire task force did not put out this report. It was the work of the Data and Research Working Group. And specifically, Dr. Harden and I worked together with some really helpful and important contributors through Alexis Daniel from Catholic Charities of Louisville and Jessry Leong at Asbury University. Dr. Harden, in addition to being the chair of the Data and Research Working Group, is a data scientist, and he currently teaches political science at Asbury University. And so I'm so grateful to Dr. Harden for all of his work and collaboration in making this report possible. And he would have loved to be here today to co-present with me, but they just finished their semester, and so I think he went off on a much-deserved vacation and couldn't be here today. So just to give you a sense of the statewide task force, which is where the Data and Research Subcommittee lives, there are several working groups: victim services, public awareness, labor trafficking, and then also the Data and Research Working Group. And each working group has different activities and tasks that they engage in. And this statewide data report was a big undertaking by the Data and Research Working Group. All right, so getting into the report itself. On your screen, you can see a high-level overview of what's in the report. There is no way that we can go through it all today, but like I said, I will make sure you have a link to access the report online so that you can read it in more detail if you would like to and as you are able. So this data report provides data specific to anti-human trafficking efforts in Kentucky. So the focus of the report is on data related to law enforcement and prosecution data, specialized services for individuals who've experienced trafficking, and training, outreach, awareness, and prevention initiatives. Federal and state level policy information is also provided as a resource in the report. Resources are cited throughout the report, many of them with hot links in the online version, to provide additional guidance and context for the report content. Many individuals and agencies have engaged in anti-trafficking work in Kentucky, some for many years. This report seeks to paint in broad strokes a picture of the anti-trafficking work done in Kentucky through both qualitative and quantitative data. In writing this report, we collected public-facing data and reached out to many community stakeholders to provide data that would otherwise be unavailable to the public, beginning with many members of the Kentucky statewide human trafficking task force, which I think includes at this point more than 150 members and agencies from across the state. However, the data provided here is partial due to resource constraints and lack of data availability and accessibility. This report is our best effort to present as comprehensive a report and as foundational a document to promote transparency and accountability of Kentucky's efforts against human trafficking as we're able to provide. So in collecting and analyzing the data in this report, trends, gaps, and challenges were identified and utilized to inform the recommendations made in the report. These recommendations provide data-driven guidance for continuing to address human trafficking in Kentucky based upon what has been learned through this extensive data collection and analysis project. So I want to spend just a minute and provide some context for the data itself, right? We strive to really be intentional about the data that's included in the report and the context provided for the data and the limitations of the data, right? There are a lot of variables in the process of data collection and reporting. So many variables. In this report, we generally use aggregate data to protect individual privacy and confidentiality. The few case examples included in the report are taken from public-facing adjudicated court cases in which the identity of the victims and survivors is protected. The case studies in the report are included to highlight some of the complexities of human trafficking cases in the courts and the multidisciplinary work involved in the cases, and the timeline from initial identification to final disposition of the cases. So the data sources throughout the report are identified with information provided regarding the time frame and other variables when we know what they are about the context for the data. As far as we know, Dr. Harden and myself, the data in this report is from trusted sources with the most recent available data at the time of publication provided. And the focus really is on data from 2021 and 2022. 2023 was just too recent for us to include solid data for the full year. So those are sort of the bookends we put around the data, although in some cases, data is more comprehensive and goes back to 2013 or even 2007 when Kentucky state law was first passed. Some data is not available and would be problematic to share given the lack of clarity related to data sourcing and context. So if data is missing from this report, that we were either unaware of the data or chose not to include the data for some of the reasons I've already mentioned. There are many limitations related to the data in the report, but we believe it's truly helpful in enabling self-evaluation of our anti-trafficking efforts. All right. So with that said, we want to jump in and just start looking at the data itself. I feel like I just missed let's see. So in Kentucky, we have several different charges related to human trafficking. In Kentucky Revised Statute, we have 7 charges. All charges are a Class B to a Class D felony and may go up a class if there is serious physical injury or death of a victim, or if the victim was a minor at the time of the offense. So just to give you an example, some of the charges are human trafficking with serious physical injury, human trafficking of a victim under 18 years of age, human trafficking for forced labor, human trafficking for commercial sexual activity, promoting human trafficking, or promoting human trafficking of a victim under the age of 18. So when we look here at the number of human trafficking incidents, those are the charges. Those charges would be the ones used at the state level to charge in a human trafficking investigation. So in Kentucky, the data shows that over time, the number of reported human trafficking incidents increased slightly in 2017, after which it really has plateaued a bit. Sex trafficking incidents are more commonly reported in Kentucky than labor trafficking incidents. And some incidents include both sex and labor trafficking. An overview of the age of the victims shows that children, youth, and young adults have been identified as victims in both sex and labor trafficking incidents, although children and youth are more represented in the data among victims of sex trafficking. In each year of reporting, with the exception of 2016, children and youth represent the majority of identified trafficking victims in sex trafficking incidents. In reviewing demographic data for offenders and victims, and I just want to say this early before we dive much into that piece of the data, it's important to consider the likely impact of training, screening, bias, and other factors influencing who's identified and reported among those incidents of labor or sex trafficking, right? And really the data that we share today shouldn't be taken as representative of the true incidence of trafficking in Kentucky. It's the information that we have based on identified cases, charges, and prosecuted cases or identified victims. All right, this is a little bit blurry, but this is a representation of some of the federal law enforcement data that we have in Kentucky. The US federal government has extended timeframes for releasing data on human trafficking. So it takes a little longer for us to get access to that data. So the data that you see is from 2021. According to the Human Trafficking Institute's 2021 Federal Human Trafficking Report, federal law enforcement data for Kentucky shows that there were no new federal criminal human trafficking charges in 2021. However, 6 defendants from previously filed human trafficking charges were convicted in 2021. Of the defendants in active federal human trafficking cases in Kentucky, 10 of those defendants were charged with sex trafficking, and 1 was charged with forced labor. Restitution was ordered to be paid in half of the federal human trafficking convictions in 2021. I want to go back for a minute to a previous screen. So this is a look again back at the state level prosecutions. State level investigations, and it breaks down for you the arrests for human trafficking offenses by law enforcement agency. And this data is from the Kentucky State Police from their Crime in Kentucky report. So since 2010, Kentucky State Police data shows that the highest number of human trafficking arrests were reported by the Lexington Police Department, and they have reported 74 arrests, followed next by the Kentucky State Police, all posts, with 60 arrests, and the Kentucky Office of the Attorney General, who's reported 34 arrests statewide. And the Louisville Metro Police Department follows that with 18 arrests. The Lexington Police Department, just to provide some additional context, began requiring human trafficking training and annual roll call training for officers in 2008 and was the first local Kentucky law enforcement agency to have a dedicated detective for human trafficking cases, which may have directly impacted the higher number of human trafficking arrests by the Lexington Police Department, right? We can't know for sure, right, all of the factors influencing that, but certainly those likely played a role. All right, so the Administrative Office of the Court in Kentucky collects and reports prosecution data from district and circuit courts throughout Kentucky. Indictments for state charges are made in district courts, and charges are disposed of in circuit courts. So the Administrative Office of the Courts provided us data on statewide human trafficking charges within cases filed since calendar year 2007 through September of 2023 under a memorandum of understanding that was established with the Administrative Office of the Courts. So this diagram that you're seeing now shows the disposition of all 277 human trafficking charges in circuit courts from January 2007 to September of 2023. All defendants found guilty in the circuit courts occurred through guilty plea bargains. So over this period, only one circuit court trial occurred, and the defendants were acquitted on all charges. Many charges were dismissed or amended in order to attain guilty pleas. So this chart shows the critical role that plea bargaining plays in securing convictions, including in trafficking cases. Prosecutors dismiss charges in the process of securing guilty pleas, and most guilty pleas are made on amended charges. So you can note that 23 of the guilty pleas here were made when the charges were amended down to non-human trafficking charges, which indicates that in some cases, prosecutors chose to use alternative charges in order to secure convictions, and they may or may not have been still a felony, could have changed to a misdemeanor. And you see that administrative procedures listed here for a couple of cases. Administrative procedure means a warrant or summons was issued on the indictment, but was not served within 60 days, and so then the case was closed. So in looking at the outcomes of circuit court cases by year of initiation, it's clear that fewer cases are prosecuted than the number of incidents reported. And this suggests, I think, various possibilities, including maybe that investigations reveal that crimes are sometimes misidentified as human trafficking incidents. And so maybe that's corrected in the courts. Maybe prosecutors don't believe that they have sufficient evidence to secure a guilty plea or conviction on the human trafficking charge. Maybe that prosecutors have a lack of familiarity or precedent in prosecuting human trafficking charges and are more familiar with other charges that they use or amend down to. And then maybe a lack of training related to human trafficking so that the charges are utilized. And previous studies have also shown that a lack of victim cooperation or having victims available as witnesses in cases can also hinder prosecutions. And certainly the prosecution should not be dependent on victim testimony, but we have seen that precedent shows that oftentimes that is the case. Something that I found really, really interesting in this report in particular is when we looked at civil cases. And I think it's in part because civil case data is often not analyzed, it's difficult to find. And we were really, really grateful to the Human Trafficking Legal Center, which is a national nonprofit that really does a lot of work nationally on legal cases and legal support advocacy for trafficking survivors, for labor and sex trafficking cases. But when we looked at the civil cases that have been filed in Kentucky, specific to human trafficking, there have been 7 filed in Kentucky's federal district courts. The first dating back to 2004, which I think is just so interesting because that's before we even passed a Kentucky state law, right? Our state law in Kentucky passed in 2007. So there was a case, a civil case filed on trafficking several years prior, which I think shows that anti-trafficking work has been happening much earlier than when our state law passed. I mean, it's local advocacy that created our state law, right? So clearly there were advocates doing good hard work years prior. And this is, I think, one example of that. So the majority of civil cases in Kentucky have involved forced labor in agriculture, primarily involving individuals with H-2A visas. And just so that folks know, H-2A visas are temporary work visas issued to folks to work in agriculture. So they come here from another country for 6 months and work in specific agriculture industries in the state and work under contract with whoever is the sponsor of their visa. And so the majority of these civil cases involved agriculture and individuals working on H-2A visas in Kentucky. So these 7 civil cases involve a total of 23 known plaintiffs, which I think underlines another important point that in human trafficking cases, and I would say specifically labor trafficking, what we see is many times there's more than one victim in the case, especially when the trafficking is happening with an employer. They might be trafficking multiple employees, right? So 3 of the civil cases involve more than one plaintiff, with the highest number of plaintiffs in one case being 9, followed by a case with 8 plaintiffs. 6 of the 7 cases involve plaintiffs who either had limited English proficiency, only spoke a language other than English, or for whom English was not their first language. The plaintiffs in these civil legal cases were represented legally by both nonprofit legal service providers and by law firms who provided pro bono legal services, which I think underlines the importance of making sure we're involving legal providers, attorneys in anti-trafficking work. So the plaintiffs who had limited English proficiency were represented by attorneys with bilingual staff who could speak the preferred language of the plaintiff or utilized qualified interpreters provided by the law firm or by nonprofit organizations throughout the case. And I think that underlines, right, that language access piece was so critical for these cases to move forward in the civil space. 5 of the 7 civil cases resulted in settlement agreements, while 2 cases resulted in judgments for the plaintiffs. And this is just to give you a sense of where these civil cases happened in this state. So the green dots you see on the screen are where these 7 civil cases were physically located. So 5 of Kentucky's civil cases occurred in the central part of the state, including cases filed in Lexington, Louisville, Richmond, Stamping Ground, which is kind of right outside of Georgetown, and Nicholas County, and the town is not identified in that case. The southernmost case in the state was located in Adairville, while the westernmost case occurred in Paducah. And that's the case that was way back in, 2004. The civil cases involving forced labor in agriculture were in Adairville, Stamping Ground, Richmond, and Nicholas County, while the forced labor in domestic servitude cases were in Lexington and Paducah, both urban areas. There was one sex trafficking case identified among these civil cases, and that occurred in Jefferson County, just outside of Louisville. All right, so now we want to get a little bit into the services piece. Specialized services provided to survivors of trafficking, and this specifically looks at data available between 2021 and 2022. So Kentucky currently has several human trafficking specialized service providers, and that includes residential services, drop-in centers, comprehensive services, and child-specific services. Some service providers maintain data specific to services provided to survivors of trafficking, while others provide more general data on overall services to individuals engaged in the sex trades or individuals with substance use disorder. So the data table here that you're seeing provides the data for 2021 and 22, which is the most recent data available sort of across the board in the state. So you can see on here several different specialized providers included. Natalie Sisters is a street ministry with a drop-in center in the Lexington area, and they specifically provide services to women, many who've been unhoused, have experiences with substance misuse, or have experienced exploitation or trafficking. So in 2021, Natalie Sisters served more than 400 women, and in 2022 served more than 500 women. And so it's a subset of all of the women served who are who've experienced maybe sex or labor trafficking. Refuge for Women, they provide residential housing to adult women who've experienced sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. And they have several locations in the US, including one in central Kentucky. So they have a variety of housing and emergency services, case management available. And in 2021, Refuge for Women provided emergency housing to 73 women, which included many hours of mental health services for their emergency housing residents. And then in 2022, they provided emergency housing to 37 women. And then 7 women were served in transitional and long-term housing there. Safe Passage is another specialized provider that focuses on children. They specifically provide services to youth. And in 2021, they provided services to 17 youth, and in 2022 to 14 youth. And they really focus on mentorship and support services to minors. They also do some prevention and awareness among the youth that they serve and out in the larger community. The Well of Lexington provides residential housing to adult female identifying survivors of sex trafficking. And so primarily the services from the Well have been residential services. In 2021, the Well provided services, they received 53 referrals from local and national organizations. And in 2022, they received 47 referrals. Services were provided to 9 survivors of sex trafficking in 2022 by the Well. And then Catholic Charities of Louisville is the only comprehensive service provider in Kentucky providing specialized services for adults or children who've experienced sex or labor trafficking, including individuals of any gender or nationality. And full disclosure, I worked at Catholic Charities in this program for almost 15 years and was actually still working there when this data was collected during the time of 2021 and 2022. So I have a lot of personal knowledge about this data, but from over this 2-year period, Catholic Charities provided services to 85 survivors, of whom 37 experienced sex trafficking, 38 experienced labor trafficking, and 10 experienced both sex and labor trafficking. This also includes 40 survivors who were identified as foreign nationals and 27 who identified as having limited English proficiency or identified a preferred language other than English, and were provided language access services. So this is a more, I feel like it's looking a little funny on the screen. I don't know if you can see it better if I do it this way and have it feels like it's a little bit blurry. Maybe you can see it better. So this is a breakdown of the Catholic Charities data, just showing by funded service who was served and in which parts of the state. So 34 survivors were served in Central Kentucky only. 22 foreign national survivors were served across the state. 23 survivors received specifically housing services in Central Kentucky, and 24 survivors received short-term comprehensive services throughout the state. I don't know if you can see it better when I kind of zoom out like that. Hopefully you can. All right. And then this is a breakdown a little bit more of the sex or labor trafficking among the individuals served by Catholic Charities. So you can see that in the top row of pie charts, the orange colored part of the pie chart identifies labor trafficking cases, and the blue is sex trafficking cases, with the gray including both sex and labor trafficking. So the box that's outlined in like a pink or orange color, that's the foreign national specific services. And you can see that among foreign nationals served in that program, the majority were labor trafficking cases, whereas among the housing services and comprehensive statewide services, the majority were sex trafficking cases. All right, so now we're going to go into talking a little bit more about data specific to children and youth. And this is data available from the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. So Kentucky state law requires DCBS to compile and submit an annual report to the Kentucky State Legislature, identifying reported cases of trafficking involving children and youth in Kentucky, with specific breakdowns by region, demographic information, and other narrative information about trafficking cases. So this shows a breakdown of cases reported by DCBS. And so they're not all confirmed cases. These are reports received by DCBS. And it shows that as of the 2021 report, a total of 1,479 cases were reported of suspected child trafficking to the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. The highest number of cases reported was in 2021 and totaled 312. So on that sort of chart, you can see with the line, 312 is the highest number that you see there, represented in 2021. And then the line across the bottom of the screen represents the labor trafficking cases among all the cases reported to the Cabinet. So they also report on demographic breakdowns. Over the past 9 years, the majority of cases reported to the Cabinet involved youth ages 13 to 17, although there were reported cases in every age range. In the most recent report from November 2021, at the time that this data report was published, the majority of reported victims were female. A total of 334 were identified as female, 44 were reported as male, and 2 as transgender or non-binary. In regards to race, In the 2021 report, 67% of reports involved youth identified as white, followed by 14% biracial or multiracial, 9% African American, 7% the race was not identified, 2% Latinx, and 1% Asian American. The majority of reported child victims were US born, with 21 reported as being foreign born. So I want to speak a little bit more to the labor trafficking reports and incidents reported to the cabinet, which is sort of the chart to the right side of the screen. So in 2015, the cabinet began tracking incidents of labor trafficking and their reporting as a subset of overall human trafficking reports. So that's why this only goes back to 2015. But in this 8-year period, from 2015 to 2022, a total of 1,724 potential trafficking incidents were reported to the cabinet, of which 3%, a total of 45 reports, referenced labor trafficking, and less than 1% referenced both sex and labor trafficking. I think some important questions that we could ask ourselves in looking at this data might be, why is that the case? Is it true that labor trafficking really happens less in this state? Is it true that really most victims are female, not male? Or might other factors play a role, such as bias in identifying cases, training, and whether we're trained on sex and labor trafficking? Are we screening for labor trafficking? Is it truly that less labor trafficking is happening, or is it about something else that's impacting the identification and reporting of those cases? So this is a look at some of the training data in the state. There are a lot of organizations providing training on trafficking, especially basic overviews of trafficking in the state. And this is just a breakdown of some of the training data. And I think the high level takeaway is at the bottom of the screen, you can see a total of just over 6,000 individuals. Do we have data for that they were trained on trafficking over this 2-year period? There were no doubt more individuals trained. We just don't have any data documenting the training that was received by us in publishing this report. The report goes on also to kind of highlight some high-risk populations for trafficking in the state, including H-2A visa workers, which we talked about in those civil cases, and youth experiencing homelessness and youth absent from care. So just so you know, if you're interested in reading more about these two populations, you can read more about that in the report with some solid citations as to where that data came from and why these populations might be higher risk for trafficking, particularly in the state of Kentucky. All right. That's just to break down a little bit more of the training data. So we're going to go on to human trafficking awareness and talk just for a minute about awareness and prevention, and then I'll move on to going through the specific recommendations. In 2021, the Kentucky Office of the Attorney General, Office of Trafficking and Abuse Prevention and Prosecution, launched a human trafficking awareness campaign entitled Your Eyes Save Lives. The campaign includes billboards, radio spots, videos, and printed resources for use in training and awareness efforts. And then in March 2023, the Centers for Disease Control funded a child sex trafficking awareness and prevention research project through the University of Kentucky, Center for Research on Violence Against Women, and the UK Center on Trauma in Children. And that project is known as See Stop Now. It has 2 phases, which includes billboards and also training for middle school staff. So those are just a couple of the larger awareness efforts that we know have been happening or are currently ongoing in the state. So something else that we look at in the report, and we talk much more in detail about it there, is human trafficking data and the Kentucky Derby. So the Kentucky Derby is often cited as being associated with human trafficking. And for the past decade, human trafficking awareness and outreach efforts have often focused on increasing access to information about trafficking and targeted law enforcement details in the days and weeks leading up to Derby. While the Kentucky Derby definitely impacts various Kentucky communities, the greatest impact really is probably in the Louisville metro area. And what we know is that in recent years, scholars and advocates have pushed back at narratives of increased human trafficking connected to large sporting events due to lack of supporting data, conflation of terminology, like conflating sex trafficking, prostitution, or sex work, media hype, and press coverage of related claims without evidence. And you can sort of see some of that media coverage on the screen here. According to scholars Martin and Hill, who we cite in the report, available empirical evidence does not suggest that major sporting events cause trafficking for sexual exploitation. And so when we review for this report, human trafficking arrest data in Kentucky from 2010 to 2022, we show a total of 18 arrests, right, by the Louisville Metro Police Department and 9 others in Jefferson County by the Attorney General's office, for example. Among all of those arrests, only one has an arrest date the first week of May, which is the week of the Kentucky Derby each year, which shows that, you know, there have been very few arrests related to human trafficking and the Kentucky Derby. So we highlight that in the report because we think that that can maybe show us there's not a substantial increase in human trafficking arrests in Louisville as a result of the Kentucky Derby. So given resource constraints, maybe local officials and policymakers might want to reflect on whether this is really a priority, looking at trafficking in the Derby. We also talk in the report some about prevention efforts, including a policy environment scan that happened in the Louisville metro area, and they identify several policy recommendations, including making sure housing is affordable and accessible, safe housing. These are things that could impact prevention and sort of be more of upstream efforts to impact trafficking. And so if you're not familiar with this policy environment scan, it's available in more detail in the report, and I would encourage you to check it out. It's a great way to learn more about how we can change policy and local services to impact prevention related to trafficking. So we cite that in the report. There's also a lot of efforts in Kentucky related to prevention education. Catholic Charities of Louisville, Gate of Hope, and Safe Passage were 3 organizations doing prevention education that we could provide data for in the report. And so this prevention education is specifically targeting children and youth, teaching skills around identifying what's a healthy relationship, how to potentially plan for your own safety, avoid risky situations, to increase your knowledge of labor and sex trafficking or exploitation, and ultimately protect children and youth. There are several different curricula being used in Kentucky. One is the My Life, My Choice curriculum for adolescent females, the IM curriculum, which is specifically for male identifying youth. And then very recently, Kentucky has started using Level 146's Not a Number curriculum, which is for youth of any gender and includes information on both sex and labor trafficking. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can find that at level146.org, the Not a Number curriculum. All right, we are getting towards the end. You've been with me so far through a lot of data. I want to just provide for you a high-level overview of the report recommendations so that you can see where this data led us, right? Because the recommendations made in the report are meant to specifically address issues that rose to the top because of the data that we identified in the report. So this is a list of the 10 recommendations, and they address issues that are really multidisciplinary in nature, and hopefully will point us forward in building capacity to address trafficking in the state. So I'm just going to quickly go through those one by one, and then hopefully that will leave us a few minutes at the end for some questions. So the first report recommendation is to increase multidisciplinary team capacity through funded positions, because we know collaboration takes intention and effort. So we really need the state to fund specific positions to address trafficking. We saw that a lot of movement was able to be made forward in Kentucky when we had a funded enhanced collaborative model task force with funded positions to support the task force work. And so if Kentucky would fund additional positions that could focus on building capacity around trafficking, that is highly recommended in the report. The second recommendation is to increase community resilience through policy change. So, looking at how can we promote conscientious service in our public servants and elected leaders, thinking about resilience in our community and establish policies that make our community safer. It might mean that some people need access to work or other sources of income, housing or healthcare, things that would hopefully be preventative in nature, in addition to continuing to improve our policies specific to human trafficking. Recommendation 3 is to increase data collection, transparency, and reporting in anti-trafficking efforts. We wish there weren't so many limitations in this report. We wish it was easy to get the data or that the data was more readily available. And so that is a significant recommendation in this report, is to do a better job in the state of collecting data, sharing data, making sure it's transparent, making sure that the data is as complete and solid as it can be, and making sure that we're assessing and learning from that data. Recommendation 4 is to focus proactive law enforcement efforts on identified victims. We know that law enforcement is a key stakeholder in anti-trafficking coordination, a primary important partner. It is imperative that law enforcement efforts are victim-centered and trauma-informed. Law enforcement actions that are taken to address human trafficking should be focused on the well-being of victims and the larger community. So the recommendation is that blind raids, stings, or details should not occur. These law enforcement actions ensnare many individuals not connected to human trafficking and rarely result in human trafficking arrests or identification of trafficking victims, which is discussed in more detail in the report. The recommendation ultimately is that proactive law enforcement actions should focus on identified or potential victims who require the support of law enforcement to exit the trafficking situation, and that specialized service providers should be available immediately so that survivors can access their basic needs, case management, and other support. This recommendation also includes that appropriate language access must be provided for any communications with identified or potential victims. Recommendation 5 is to prioritize survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive human trafficking training. It is imperative that we have solid training in this state, and we've made so many strides in that regard. But in order for professionals in government and community-based organizations to be positioned to address human trafficking, prevention and response, training must be provided regularly, because that will ensure that our knowledge is increasing and our skills continue to develop and are sustainable over time. Recommendation 6 is to increase and improve efforts to address labor trafficking. Data shows that labor trafficking is occurring in Kentucky communities. Despite there being fewer investigations and prosecutions of labor trafficking, there are a significant number of individuals supported by specialized service providers who experience labor trafficking, and we saw so many of the civil cases involve labor trafficking. They often involve multiple victims in both formal and informal labor sectors. So unfortunately, however, we see that labor trafficking is not often addressed in training, awareness, or outreach efforts. But labor trafficking should be included in anti-trafficking initiatives statewide. So there is existing expertise locally and nationally that we can leverage to build capacity to address labor trafficking. And I just want to share with you one example, which is a National Labor Trafficking Conference that's coming up in October of this year, and registration is open now. But that's a great way to build our capacity to address labor trafficking, is to proactively engage in training opportunities so that we can learn more about how to better identify and respond to labor trafficking in our communities. And I'll be sure and share some of these in the chat before we finish. All right, recommendation 7 is to improve standards of care among service providers, because we know that organizations providing direct service to survivors should really be prioritizing their well-being and ensure that their policies and practices are trauma-informed and survivor-centered and minimize harm. So we encourage self-evaluation and external evaluation of these programs to make sure that we have the highest standards of care that we can in providing services. Recommendation 8 is to support data-driven outreach and awareness efforts. So we know that these efforts should be informed by data. And so that's why this recommendation is based on the data that we provided in this report. requires multiple steps, first collecting the data and then using it to inform our work, because this data can highlight trends or issues that were previously unknown or misunderstood. And it really is imperative that we shift our awareness and outreach efforts to match what the data is showing us and what we see actually work or is needed in our state. Recommendation 9 is to increase efforts to address familial trafficking. So what we saw in the DCBS data, which the report goes into in more detail, is that about half of reports of trafficking to DCBS involved a custodial guardian, which is a pretty broad definition in the state, but largely would include a lot of familial trafficking. And so we need to increase efforts to address familial trafficking. We need to increase our studies and understanding of that issue, and also training for professionals who would be identifying and responding to those cases, and also better understanding of interventions that work to address familial trafficking. And then the final recommendation, recommendation 10, is to prioritize language access in anti-trafficking efforts, because human trafficking impacts many diverse populations. So accessibility and language access limitations are often exploited by traffickers. In order to identify, respond to, and support victims of trafficking and survivors, they must be able to access information that's understandable to them. It's crucial. And that includes information and communication for individuals who are blind or visually impaired, deaf, hard of hearing, or folks who have limited English proficiency. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, and requires recipients of federal financial assistance to take reasonable steps to make their programs and services accessible by folks with limited English proficiency. And so that is the final recommendation of the report. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I'd be happy to use those to answer some questions. This is my information, and also the coteryonline.com is where you can go to access the report. It's available on the resources page, but I will also, in these last couple of minutes, try to share the links in the chat.
I posted a few while you were talking. I found the report online and posted that link. And for everyone on, all of the links that Marissa referenced during her presentation, I'm going to send a follow-up email here in a minute that says thank you for attending. And I'm going to try to put as many of those resources in there as I can. We had one, just kind of a comment, but it's really a question too in the chat box. And we had an attendee say, sorry, it jumped. That she was wondering, they were wondering about the connection, the relationship between the data and youth utilizing social media and technology.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that we broadly know that human trafficking intersects a lot with technology use, both for the recruitment of potential victims and also the actual facilitation of the trafficking. And there are a lot of great resources out there to educate parents, caretakers, professionals, and youth about how to, have increased safety online. However, I think they're pretty varied and they're pretty diverse. So actually, I have to give a lot of credit to DCBS. They're working on developing a training now to discuss in much more detail the intersections of technology and trafficking, not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. So I think the best place to find data now is probably through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And they have a lot of great resources that provide training through some recorded video training series that they have. But like I said, it's pretty diverse. And it's not all in one place. So we know that there's intersections. I don't think we understand them well. And we don't have, I think, a lot of good data showing clearly what that looks like. And so I believe that DCBS in the next few months is hoping to provide a training that addresses that in more detail. So yes, it's an important issue and we're working on highlighting it better. So thank you for that question. It's a good question.
And are you aware of any data about the relationship between youth previously involved in the foster care system and human trafficking?
Right. So among the group of high-risk populations that's addressed in the report, it does sort of talk among youth experiencing homelessness about the intersection, some with foster care. But I will also say that DCBS addresses that population in some of their reports. So the DCBS data that's in our data report comes from DCBS's report to the state legislature. You can access those online. And so you can read more about sort of the intersections with foster care. I will also say that at a national level, there are several organizations that highlight those intersections, including Youth Collaboratory and the Family Youth Services Bureau and HHS. They do a great job of addressing those intersections and have some reports, I think, specifically about human trafficking and foster care. So does the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Thank you. I was making a note of that to look for that to send it out. Does anybody else have any questions? I know that we are at the end of our time, but if someone has a burning question they want to ask, we'll take another question or two. Marissa put the link in there for the National Labor Trafficking Conference that's coming up October 16th and 17th. And I will also include that in the follow-up email as well. You're getting a lot
And I
of
also
thank
just put in
yous.
the link to the statewide task force. If you're interested in learning more about the statewide task force, I put that link to their website in the chat, and also you can access the report there as well.
The Statewide Human Trafficking Task Force, if you're interested in that, most of their meetings are virtual or at least hybrid. So no matter where you are in the state, if you would like to attend, you can. Hey, I just want to say thank you so much, Marissa, for being here. I always love it when you attend System of Care Academy and you always share great information. And so for everyone asking about the PowerPoint and resources, again, we'll send that out after. If you think of any questions, Marissa listed her contact information in the chat. You can also send those to us and we will help get answers for you. So thank you so much, Marissa.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.